Solve by factoring. We have when we have an equation that has a lead coefficient of 1, we've learned methods for factoring it, but we also have a couple of extra steps that we have to do before we can apply all the methods that we've learned, and something that we do at the end. So I'm just going to write you a little list of what we need to do. The first thing is we want to get the equation, set equation equal to 0. That means to put it in standard form. That's what we call it. And then the next thing we will do is the factor completely. And the two methods that you've learned are the greatest common factor and the sum product method. So you're going to use one of those two methods. We're not going to give you anything different than those. And then you will apply the zero factor property, which we'll go to here in a second. And the end result of it is you set each factor equal to 0 and then solve. You have some little equations to solve, and then the last thing is to check. So now what is this zero factor property and how does it apply to what we're doing? What we're saying is if we have two things being multiplied and set to 0, then one of them has to be 0 or the other, because there's no other way to multiply two numbers and get 0. One of the two numbers has to be 0 or both of them. But what we're looking at is going to be stuff like this. X minus 5, x plus 3. So either this has to be 0 or this has to be 0. And that's how we apply that property. We say either one of those two, when you set them equal to 0 and you have two things being multiplied, either this one's 0 or this one's 0. That's all you have. Okay, so let's take a look at this. We have x squared plus 9x plus 14. That sounds really familiar, like we might have done that one already. So our sum is 9, product is 14. Looking for things that multiply to 14, so 1 times 14 and 2 times 7, and add up to 9. So 2 plus 7 is 9. So there's my pair, and it's all positives. Remember, there's a 1 for the lead coefficient, so I'm golden. I can write the factors x plus 2 times the quantity x plus 7. And now this time it's different because I have this equals 0 on the end. And this is where this property comes in. If I have two things multiplied set to 0, either one of them is 0 or the other is 0. So I know either this one is 0 or this one is 0. So I'm going to write them each out. X plus 2 equals 0 or x plus 7 equals 0. And even though I have an x, I still know that whole binomial has to be 0, one of those two, so I can set them each to 0 and figure out what values of x will make that happen. So now I have some simple equations to solve, so we're on step 4 there. So subtract 2 here from both sides, and I get x equals negative 2. And then here I'll subtract 7 from both sides, and I get x equals negative 7. So my solution is x is a negative 2 or a negative 7. And that's how I would write it. And then to check, I check each one separately. So the x equals 2 means that wherever I see the x squared, I'm putting in the 2, or wherever I see the x, and then plus 14, and it's supposed to be 0. And we'll just put in the negative 2 for each of those. I left that off on my check there. X is a negative 2. And then I'll multiply these out. So I get negative 2 times negative 2. That's why I wanted those parentheses there. Negative 2 squared means negative 2 times negative 2. And when I multiply negative times negative, I get a positive, and so that's a positive 4. So that's important to keep track of what you're squaring, and in this case, it's the entire x that I'm squaring, so the negative goes with the 2 on the squared part. And then now I'll do 9 times negative 2, so that's a negative 18 plus 14 equals 0. So 4 minus 18, that's going to give me negative 14 plus 14 equals 0. So that works out. I got 0 equals 0. That means that -2 is a good number for us. Then I'll check the -7. X equals -7. And so I'm going to square whatever the x is plus 9 times whatever the x is plus 14 equals 0. Plug in my -7. And I have -7 squared. So -7 squared. It's the same thing as what we did with the -2. It's -7 times -7 or positive 49. So I have 49 minus, and 9 times -7 is going to be -63 plus 14 equals 0. And so I get a -14 plus 14 equals 0, which of course is a true statement. And so my -2 and my -7 both work. Next problem. Here I have x squared plus 2x equals 8. I need to set it equal to 0 first. Because it is not, I have it set equal to 8. And I don't have an 8 factor property, just a 0 factor property. So I subtract 8 from both sides. And I have x squared plus 2x minus 8 equals 8 minus 8 gives me 0. So now I have it set to 0. Now I can actually factor. So I'm going to factor that. So I see I have a lead coefficient of 1. So my sum is 2. My product is -8. I have 1 times 8, 2 times 4, 3 doesn't work, and 4 is listed. So that's my complete list. I have a negative product and a positive sum. So my smaller number needs to be negative. Remember, if you're not sure, you can go ahead and write out both possibilities. So there's the ones I think are going to work, but I can also try 1 times -8 and 2 times -4, just to be sure. And I want the pair that comes out to a positive 2. So when I add -1 plus 8, I get a positive 7. And when I add -2 plus 4, I get a positive 2. And that is the positive 2 I'm after. So there's my pair. So I can write it in factored form, x minus 2, x plus 4, set to 0. And then I need to apply my 0 factor property. And that means I set each one to 0. X minus 2 equals 0. And the other possibility, x plus 4 equals 0. Remember, one of those two has to be 0 for me to have a product of 0. So solve these little equations. Add 2 to both sides on that one. Subtract 4 from both sides on the other. And so I have x equals 2. X equals -4. So I have two possibilities, 2 or a -4. And then I'd like to check each one. So x equals 2. I'm going to check I have something that x squared plus 2 times whatever my x is should be equal to 8. That's my original equation. I want to use it just as it is. Plug in that 2 for my x that I think is going to work. And I have 2 squared, no sign, so it's just 4. And then 2 times 2, so plus 4, equals 8. Yes, that's true. Let's try the other one. X equals -4. So whatever I have squared plus 2 times x equals 8. And then I'm filling in with my -4. Remember, -4 times -4, that's going to give me a positive 16. And then 2 times -4 will give me -8. And does that equal 8? Yes, it does. So that answer checked out as well.